in a post-conflict situation like Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
And now we will turn to Mark to wrap us up before we get to question and answer.
All right. Thank you very much. First, of course, like my colleagues, I'd like to thank the United States Institute for Peace for holding this event and inviting me to be here. Also for allowing me to promote my book shamelessly as well, which I always appreciate on a new stage. Just to say a couple words about the book. It's called Afghanistan Transition Under Threat, and Alex held it up there. There are a couple copies, I believe, still on the table. Unfortunately, I just discovered that the order forms are still on my desk in Canada, so I can't hand those out here today. But you can purchase it on the internet or come to me after, and I can give you my card and I can arrange a sale for you if you'd like. Now, the book, I think it complements Alex's new book and USIP's new book quite well, because we actually do look at the past. We look at the past 7 years, and we chart developments in the state-building process. Look at the lessons learned, because I think we have to understand those lessons learned in order to look at the future. And we break it down into 3 different transitions. We view the larger transition in Afghanistan as encompassing 3 different transitions. That's the political transition, the economic transition, and the security transition. So we take a look at what has happened in the past, the mistakes made, the challenges that have been confronted or overcome, or obstacles that remain, and we do that with an eye to what can happen in the future. I believe we have 2 authors from the book in the room today. Minister Jalali has authored one of the chapters, as well as I think Seema Patel is there as well, who authored one of the chapters. But other authors include Ambassador Haqqani, the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, authored a chapter before he became ambassador. Professor William Maley of the ANU in Australia, and Professor Antonio Giustozzi, or Dr. Antonio Giustozzi from the London School of Economics. So I think it's worth taking a look at. Now, I've been asked to speak today about the role of the international community in building up the Afghan security sector. And I'm also going to, within this, come to you from a non-American perspective. I am Canadian and based at a think tank and a university in Canada, and where Afghanistan is the central policy issue, foreign policy issue. It was the central policy issue until the economic crisis, but has been surpassed somewhat since. So it's clear now that security sector reform is the exit strategy for the international community. I think Minister Jalali emphasized that quite well. As your now outgoing president, President Bush, stated in reference to Iraq, when they step up, we can step down. And that's the same logic should apply to Afghanistan. International forces can step down and start to withdraw from the country once the Afghan security forces are capable of assuming responsibility in the mantle for security. Now, we've known the importance of security sector reform for some time to the state-building process. However, despite this reality, the results of the process have been somewhat disappointing. Now, you can always blame resources. There hasn't been enough money, which is true. At times there hasn't, especially in the beginnings of the process. There hasn't been enough mentors, particularly for the police, and that's absolutely correct as well. And there hasn't been enough equipment. But it's more than just a resource issue why the process is faltering. And I'm going to name a few reasons why I think the process is faltering, and it leads us to where I think the process should go. First of all, the process has mainly been framed as a train and equip program. Well, that's not quite what security sector reform is, which takes a more holistic look at the security sector and specifically emphasizes governance. There's been, in my opinion, a lack of attention on management structures within the security sector. For instance, the Ministry of Interior. To this day, despite the valiant efforts of Professor Jalali, or Minister Jalali when he was there, the right amount of resources was not dedicated from the very beginning in reforming the ministry, the institution that is supposed to manage the police, which today is, I would say most people admit, is one of the more dysfunctional institutions in the country, despite being one of the most important. It still lacks basic systems that function effectively, like payroll, procurement, logistics. It faces huge levels of corruption, which, according to one analyst, 80% of the ministry, of the staff of the ministry, are involved on one level or another, direct or indirect, in the drug trade. So this is one of the gaps there. There has to be more of a focus, and you can see this across the security sector, on the institutions, the agencies, the structures intended to manage, provide oversight and accountability over the security institutions. There's also a high level of factionalism we see within these institutions, which has been extremely problematic and is filtered down into the security forces. The second major gap is the justice gap. I think that the justice sector has not received the requisite attention it needs. It's only received a tiny fraction of the money that's been allocated to the security sector as a whole. Now, mind you, it's not as cost-intensive as rebuilding an army or a police force, but it requires more resources, more of a proportional resources, in order to get it up and running. Now, we know from post-conflict reconstruction that the security sector cannot stand on its feet. It can't function effectively unless it has a justice system that is in working order. And that is still a big question mark in Afghanistan today. As was mentioned, there's widespread corruption in the justice sector. For a great deal of time, there was no coherent strategy. There was huge differences, particularly among the Afghan permanent justice institutions, and as well as the different donors who were implementing justice reform programs. Now, there is a strategy now in place after the Rome Conference on justice sector reform in Afghanistan, but I think the jury's still out where we will really see a commitment to this strategy over the long term and see it implemented appropriately. Now, as the justice system is in many ways still in tatters, you see most Afghans, 80 to 90%, looking to traditional justice mechanisms. Yet, despite the importance of this, despite the fact that the majority of Afghans view the formal justice system as too expensive, out of touch with local realities, corrupt, and they're going to the informal justice system, there's been very few programs to look at how you can develop a complementary relationship between the formal and the informal justice system. And I would compliment here USIP, who's done really innovative and pioneering work on this area. It's still, though, in its infancy. And I think that this is an area that the international community should focus on. How do you bring together the informal and formal justice systems? How do you reconcile them? Another issue that's been missing is corrections. Corrections is the poor man of the security sector reform process. Of all of the surveys that have been done of the correction system in Afghanistan, they've found mostly that the vast majority of prisons in the country don't come close to meeting international standards. I always like, whenever I mention corrections, I always recall an interesting incident. In 2004, I was in the office of a UNAMA corrections advisor, and he showed me a cable on his desk. And it was about a prison break that happened in eastern Afghanistan. And it said, prison break at this particular prison, 8 inmates and 3 guards escape. The reality is, I asked the prison advisor, why? How could this be? This is bizarre. And he said, well, the reality is the conditions are so bad, and these guards must remain in these facilities, that even they desire very strongly to get out. So I think that emphasizes the problem here. And there's been very little investment in this area, yet it's so critical. I think when we see the prison break in Sarposa, for example, you can, of course, this was a coordinated attack by insurgents to release their compatriots, but still, I think you can also look at the stability of the prison system, and the lack of stability is one of the reasons why something like that could happen. Now, the third big gap, and this is more looking to the future, and it's been mentioned particularly by Minister Jalali, is the sustainability issue. My figure, which was from 2005, is that security expenditures actually equaled 500% of internal revenue. I'm happy to hear that it's now only 300%. But this is a huge problem. The reality is that that even if the most ambitious and optimistic projections about the Afghan economy come true and internal revenue generating capacity come true, they can't afford the security sector that is being built. Now, in a perfect world, we can say that indefinitely international assistance will remain for Afghanistan, but I don't think that is also realistic. And if you examine the history of Afghanistan and external patrons in Afghanistan, when the money dried up in the past, that's when you start to see insurrections and revolts in Afghanistan and the armies start to mutiny. So I think, especially when you can't pay salaries. And I think this is something we really should start to think about now. Now, the bottom line is, and this has been mentioned several times, this is a long-term process, and there's been a lot of short-term thinking that's gone on. The hardships and the obstacles that the security sector reform process has faced has prompted many people to say that, well, that creating formal institutions is actually just not feasible. Or they'll say, you often hear, that at least in the short term we have to find transitional structures to get us through this period that we can't find in the formal security apparatus. And this leads to my next point, which is you see in numerous press reports, and I was just reading one by Peter Bergen on the way here, that recently NATO reaching out to tribal leaders to empower militias to take a more bold role in security, perhaps arming militias, primarily in the conflict-afflicted areas of the South and East. You hear in the context of the United States, people believe that perhaps you can replicate the Sons of the Soil program in Iraq, part of the Sunni awakening in Afghanistan, by empowering these tribes. The outgoing Canadian commander of Regional Command South in Afghanistan, Major General Marc Lassard, urged his Dutch successor, when he just a few days ago passed on command, to reach out to local communities. And I agree with him. But he also warned, with this in mind, he warned against cookie-cutter solutions from Iraq or elsewhere. Now, there are many reasons why I think we should be wary of talk of arming tribal groups in Afghanistan. First of all, it's been done before, and that should be made clear. The coalition armed and used proxy militias in the immediately after the Taliban regime's fall to combat groups, particularly in the East and South, and many of these groups actually manipulated the coalition to fight their own battles and to achieve their own parochial interests. We saw the Afghan National Auxiliary Police, which I think most people believe the ANAP was a failure. We saw that, in my own research, many people I spoke to had intimate knowledge of this program, felt that maybe between 1/5 and 1/4 of the irregular militiamen who were brought into the ANAP were actually Taliban sympathizers. There was no proper vetting mechanism. In essence, you were still empowering different warlord commanders because you were using their troops. Finally, if you even go back to the Najibullah period and look at how the PDPA regime, the communist regime, utilized and employed tribal militia groups, one of the reasons for its collapse was, in fact, many of these groups turned against the regime in the end. So I think that there are some cautionary tales in both the immediate and longer-term history of Afghanistan. Secondly, it's a politically divisive approach. Let's remember that we're talking here mostly about Pashtun tribes in the South and East. Well, I can tell you that many of the northern groupings will not view kindly the idea of rearming the Pashtuns at the same time that they just largely, at least disarmed symbolically, with the DDR process. Many people I spoke to, they refer to any of these type of programs, and one individual, a prominent commander in the north, called the ANAP in the south Karzai's Taliban. And he went on to warn me that we still have our guns as well. So I think that there are extreme also political dangers, and this has to be handled delicately. Thirdly, I think it undermines what was the most expensive DDR program in history, which, although has many faults, did successfully demobilize over 60,000 ex-combatants and collected 40,000 weapons. In this program, ostensibly, you'd be funneling weapons back to the same militiamen that you were just trying to disarm. Finally, I think that we have to understand also that in the 30-year Civil War, many of the tribal authority was fractured in many parts of the South and the East. You saw that traditional tribal authority was superseded by and supplanted by warlord power in many areas. Those who accrued power through their access to the illicit economy, their ability to co-opt aid, and so on. So we should ask ourselves, who are these legitimate commanders that we would be dealing with? I'm not saying not to reach out to tribal leaders. Absolutely, that's essential. I'm not saying not to look to the informal system. In the justice sector, I'm encouraging that. I'm just saying that there is need for very careful thought on how this is done, particularly when you talk about empowering militias. Just on the way ahead, a few remarks. On the police, I think that this is one of the key areas that has to be focused on improving the police. I was very encouraged on my last trip to Afghanistan looking at CSTC Alpha's focused district development program, which goes into communities, takes out the local police, trains them at a local training center, and replaces them with the Afghan civil order police, a more professional force, until that newly trained local group can return. It has shown many gains, and I think it should be the way forward, this type of model district program. I think that the success of the Afghan civil order police, though, also shows that maybe there's some room for, as Minister Jalali was saying, to start thinking about restructuring the police. Maybe focusing more attention on this better trained national police that could be deployed elsewhere in the country. Apparently, the local population were shocked to find out how actually a professional police is supposed to act. They had been so used to their local predatory police. I think there's time to talk about perhaps a paramilitary police who can do some of the counterinsurgency work, like a gendarmerie, rather than throwing community police into the breach, which they're not trained to do. Secondly, in terms of the Afghan National Army, I think although it's one of the success stories of the process, I think we have to also think innovatively about what are ways to accelerate the development. I don't necessarily agree with some of these ideas, but I think one of them that has come out recently is the idea of a reserve force which would allow the establishment of greater capacity, increased numbers, without necessarily looking to mobilize and empower non-state actors. Now, I'll just conclude with a couple remarks. Canada is pulling out our troops. We're pulling out our troops in 2011. Our government says that we are basing this target because this is when we believe the Afghan security forces will be capable of assuming the job in places like Kandahar. I think this is wishful thinking and partially a political game, I must say. But we have to remember that surely progress has been made in the security sector. But the Afghan security institutions are not capable today of assuming this role, and I don't think they'll be capable of assuming a full security responsibility for many years to come. We have to be prepared to remain in this advisory and support role and continue to provide full assistance for some time. But I think in order to accelerate and to ensure this happens in as short a period as possible, we have to revise our priorities. We have to think longer term. And we have to adjust our direction where things aren't working. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. I think that was a fascinating overview. What we're going to do now is take questions at both sides of the microphone. Unfortunately, because we're recording this, I'm going to have to ask people to stand up and speak. Let me just start off by throwing a question maybe to the first three panelists, just to give a brief comment on Mark's point about tribal militias. We are at a phase in Afghanistan in many ways because of Iraq, but also because of Afghan and Pakistani history,